Okay, go.
Watch where your finger is.
November 1944. The rain had been falling since before dawn, a cold, needling rain that soaked through wool uniforms and turned the jungle paths of the Philippines into sucking rivers of mud. I imagine the scene clearly because I have stood in places like this, years later, where the ground still seems to remember the weight of boots and fear. A small Japanese patrol moved slowly through the undergrowth. No shouted orders, no clatter of metal, only the soft slap of boots, the hiss of breath, and somewhere in the darkness, a weapon that did not announce itself. When it fired, men fell before they understood they were under attack. There was no warning shout, no thunderous report, just death arriving quietly. This is where my story begins, because this is where the myth of the silent Japanese type 100/44 submachine gun truly lived. I have spent decades studying weapons of the Second World War, but some arms refuse to be understood by specifications alone. They demand atmosphere. The Type 100/44 is one of them. On paper, it looks almost unremarkable. A submachine gun, a 8x22mm Nambu cartridge, a modest rate of fire. Yet veterans remembered it differently. They described sudden collapses, shadows firing shadows, and the unnerving sense that the jungle itself had learned to kill. The mystery was never that the Type 100 existed. It was why it killed without warning, and why those who faced it remembered silence more than sound. Japan entered the war with a problem few outside its officer corps understood. The Imperial Japanese Army had been shaped by earlier conflicts in China and Manchuria, wars of movement, bayonets, and long rifles. Submachine guns were not a priority. They were seen as weapons for police or criminals, not soldiers. Meanwhile, Europe was already proving that close-range automatic fire dominated cities, jungles, and trenches. By the time Japanese commanders felt this lesson biting back at them, the war had changed. They needed compact firepower for night attacks, jungle fighting, and sudden ambushes. They needed a weapon that could be carried silently, used quickly, and trusted absolutely. The result was the Type 100 submachine gun, first introduced in limited numbers in 1942, and later refined into what collectors now call the Type 100/44. I say collectors deliberately, because during the war, this weapon was rare enough that many Allied soldiers never saw one up close, but those who did rarely forgot it. The engineers at Nambu Arms Company built it with a precision that feels almost out of place in a nation struggling under bombing and shortages. It was milled steel, not stamped, solid, heavy in the hands. The action was simple blowback, firing from an open bolt, but executed with Japanese attention to smoothness. The cartridge, the 8x22mm Nambu, is often mocked today for its modest power. And yet, in the distances where the Type 100 lived, 20-30 meters in thick vegetation, power was not the point. Control was. The weapon's rate of fire hovered around 450 to 500 rounds per minute, slower than the American Thompson, far slower than the German MP-40. This slower rhythm mattered. It made the gun controllable. It kept muzzle climb low. It allowed short, precise bursts that felt almost deliberate rather than frantic. And then there was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. The Type 100 was not truly silent. No firearm of the era was. But compared to the sharp crack of a Garand or the heavy bark of a Thompson, the Type 100 had a softer, flatter report. The subsonic nature of the 8mm Nambu round combined with the long barrel and smooth action, produced a duller sound that did not echo as violently in jungle or urban spaces. Some late-war variants were even designed to accept suppressors, though these were extremely rare. More importantly, Japanese doctrine emphasized night fighting, ambush, and infiltration. Shots were fired close, often only a few rounds. By the time the sound registered, the bullets had already done their work. I have read after-action reports where Allied soldiers described men collapsing as if tripped, without hearing a clear shot. This is not poetry. It is confusion made official. In darkness, under stress, human perception collapses. A quieter weapon does not need to be silent to feel invisible. The Type 100 exploited this brutally. Operationally, the weapon appeared most often in the hands of paratroopers, naval landing forces, and elite infantry units. These were not conscripts sent forward with outdated rifles. These were trained men, often veterans, taught to move at night and strike suddenly. In Burma, in New Guinea, in the Philippines, there are scattered but consistent accounts of Japanese patrols slipping close before opening fire. A short burst, 2 men down, then movement. Silence again. The Type 100 was not used to dominate a battlefield. It was used to unbalance it. One of the most chilling anecdotes I encountered came from a British officer in Malaya, written years after the war. His unit had been probing a Japanese-held village at dusk. There was no artillery, no heavy fighting, just tension. Suddenly, a sentry collapsed. No shot was heard clearly. Then another. Panic rippled through the line. Men fired wildly into the dark. Only later did they recover the bodies and realize the wounds were small, neat, close together. Submachine gun fire, fired calmly, from close range. The officer wrote that the silence was worse than the killing. It felt, in his words, deliberate. Technically, the Type 100 had flaws. The magazines held only 30 rounds and were side-mounted, making the weapon unbalanced. Manufacturing quality declined sharply in late 1944 as Japan's industrial base crumbled. Some late models were crude, almost desperate in their construction. And yet, the early and mid-war guns worked. They fed reliably. They handled dirt and humidity better than many expected. The Japanese emphasis on maintenance and discipline mattered here. A well-cleaned weapon, used sparingly, retains its effectiveness long after louder. More brutal guns reveal their presence. Comparisons are inevitable. Against the American Thompson, the Type 100 seems underpowered. Against the German MP40, it lacks simplicity of mass production. But comparisons miss the point. The Thompson was a hammer, loud and reassuring to its user. The MP40 was a compromise between cost and effectiveness. The Type 100 was a knife. Quiet, precise, psychological. It was not designed to win firefights. It was designed to end them before they began. The human impact of this cannot be overstated. Soldiers fear what they cannot hear or see. Loud weapons give warning. Silence steals certainty. Allied troops quickly learned to associate sudden, unexplained casualties with Japanese infiltration. This bred paranoia. Night watches became tense. Men fired at shadows. Sleep eroded. In this way, the Type 100 killed more than bodies. It killed confidence. I often think about the Japanese soldiers who carried it. They were fighting a losing war, often isolated, undersupplied, and told that surrender was dishonor. For them, the Type 100 was not just a weapon. It was a way to strike back, to remind the enemy that the jungle was not safe. In their hands, it became an extension of doctrine, culture, and desperation. By the war's end, the Type 100 faded quickly. Few were captured. Fewer still were studied in depth. The world moved on to stamped steel, higher rates of fire, and louder, more dominant designs. And yet, when I speak to veterans or read their accounts, the memory lingers. Not of noise, of absence, of the moment when men fell and no one understood why. This is why the Type 100/44 killed without warning. Not because it was magical or uniquely deadly, but because it was used with intent, in the right environment, by soldiers trained to exploit silence itself. It reminds us that in war, terror is not always announced. Sometimes it arrives quietly, already too close, and by the time you hear it, the story is already over.